Let's take a look at the weather for the last week or so here. That is the internet weather. And in particular, very strong similarities to last week. In fact, very much in the same order as well. The first one here is scan probes on port 1434 UDP. This is a Microsoft SQL database. And key word here being that's on protocol UDP, that is user datagram protocol. In this particular case, what we're seeing is continued probing activity on that port. In addition to that probing activity, I want to point out a specific thing that we did not talk about last week, and this is a relatively new development. You can see here where the number of packets in the probing activity relative to the number of probes has diverged. That is generally, if we look back in time here, there's a very close correlation between the number of packets and the number of probes. What we're seeing here is a strong diversion from that. And that's really a very strong suggestion that it's something other than probing activity. And sure enough, what we're seeing here is that port 1434 UDP is being used in distributed reflective denial of service attacks. That is, they're scanning out, looking for databases that have this port exposed to the internet, and then reflecting attacks off of those using a spoof source address in the packet, and then having that response go to the target of attack. So if you see this probing activity against your database, it may not, in fact, be, particularly if you see lots of probes from the same source address, it's most likely that database is being used to facilitate an attack. It could have an impact on the performance of the system. I'm really not even sure that there is a significant amplification effect associated with this, but it does provide some opportunity for the attackers to hide a little bit more, and then, obviously they have some motivation to hide where the attack is actually coming from. I guess the other thing I'll point out here is the size of the attacks that we're seeing so far are relatively small, but that is not unusual in the early phases of using new ports for attacks of this type. And we have not seen this port used in this type of attack in the past, but because it's UDP and is not basically requiring an acknowledged connection, it does facilitate performing this sort of reflective attack. So we'll have to see if there are if this increases over time or if it's sort of a passing phase. Next item here is scan probes on port 7001 TCP. Again, we reported on this last week. Just a little bit of a different flavor in reporting at this time. I'm looking at 60 days worth of data here, and you can see that it's been fairly regular activity, and it turns out that this specific IP address, there's a single address from China that's doing a lot of this probing activity. It is also probing on a number of other ports. 110, 1433, 1521, 1723, 3128, 3306, 7001 as we noted, and 8081. So this basically equates to email, databases, proxies, and I guess 1723, if I remember correctly, is associated with a multimedia protocol.
Yeah, H.323 or something.
H.323, yes,
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. So, and as I said, fairly consistent activity since about mid-November, and basically attributable to one source that's doing that activity. So you can imagine what types of things they might be trying to do with that information. Now, similarly, I think I had these bunched together last week with another address. There's another source that's basically showed up on our radar is probing on port 32764 TCP. Again, the majority of those probes are from a single source, and this one's scanning on sort of a different group of ports, port 5800, port 5900, 7001 as we noted earlier, 8009, 8090, 8088, 11211, and 32764 as we're discussing here. These basically equate to remote access, proxies, and backdoor type activity. So again, probably not for any what I would describe as a legitimate purpose. Next item here is scan probes on port 53413 UDP, and I think what I need to do here is basically start out with a correction. I think I had reported at least in one report that there was a backdoor associated with the Netis brand home routers. And the mistake that I'd made apparently was that I had reported that backdoor was on port 53413 TCP, while in fact that port is on that backdoor port is 53413 UDP. And there's a reference here to the article that describes that was discovered by Trend Micro. But nevertheless, we have been tracking activity on both TCP and UDP and reporting on the UDP activity, and now we have a clear explanation as to why it's showing up on UDP. So on the what we're looking here are actually the number of source addresses that are probing on port 53413 UDP. And back around November 11th, we saw sort of a big increase in the number of sources, telltale sign of a botnet that's doing the scanning activity, and sort of the trailing or die-off or a decay of activity as those source addresses are completing their task. We're in the third phase of that activity, actually on the tail end of the third phase of the activity. As of, I guess around the 9th of December, we saw the beginning of that third phase when we just reported last week. And then it's tailed off, and we're kind of down to that baseline level in terms of probing activity or sources of that probing activity. And the thing I'll also point out here is that each time they've increased the number of sources that are doing the scanning activities, which suggests that they are being more successful at recruiting more into the botnet. Now, the number of sources that we see here does not necessarily indicate the size of the botnet. It just means that they've dedicated that portion toward the probing activity or recruiting activity, whereas they may have other portions that are being used in denial of service attacks, for example. Right, John?
Yeah.
So, we have seen some denial of service attacks that we believe are attributable to these types of devices, as well as other internet-connected devices that are being exploited, at the very least used in attack activity, if not a part of a botnet.
Yeah.
And just to give you, this is the exact same graph that I showed last week, just for another reference, the distribution of the sources associated with that, sort of that peak point in the third phase. And these devices, they are a Chinese-made device. They seem to be much more popular in China and Asia-Pacific region, Europe, not as much in the United States, but they certainly are available domestically as well. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports, port 135 is at the top of the list. We reported on this last week and have had a number of discussions about it, so I won't repeat that today, but if you're interested in an explanation on the top item on the list, go ahead and refer to last week's program. Next on the list is port 8080 TCP, looking for open proxies for a variety of apparent reasons to anonymize activity or perhaps even to gain access to systems. Followed by port 22 and port 23, oftentimes brute force password guessing, trying to get access to the command line on systems that are exposed to the internet, oftentimes associated with internet connected devices that have telnet service exposed, and you may not have even known about it. Sometimes it's not even documented.
Yeah, it's a lot of home routers that, for whatever reason, they got telnet listening and open and exposed to the internet.
Yeah,
especially
a lot of these
in
devices,
countries other than the U.S. too. Yeah. I don't know why, but
a lot of these devices, they're using they're being developed on basically an embedded processor system emulation platform, and that's the base configuration, and they get it out the door without doing the proper security lockdown associated with those devices. So, odd as this may seem, even for consumers, we kind of need to get into this mode where you're actually scanning your own network to see what vulnerabilities might exist.
Yeah.
Next item is port 53 UDP, oftentimes looking for DNS servers that can be used in open DNS resolvers, that is, could be used in reflection attacks. Followed by port 80 TCP and 443 TCP, looking for those web servers, port 445, and then port 1433 TCP. Now this is a little different than the 1434 TCP or UDP that we were discussing earlier, but again, looking for Microsoft SQL database servers that might be exposed to the internet, and could possibly have that UDP port exposed as well. Looking at the most sources doing the probing, at the top of the list in terms of actual services, port 23 TCP, we talked about these Internet of Things. I noticed that not too long ago actually there was a significant amount, in fact I probably should have included it as a graph here, but really a significant number of sources doing scanning activity on port 23 TCP. It's actually tailed off a little bit since this chart was growing. Otherwise, I think it would have been at the top of the list. Followed by port 445 TCP, that's configure infections, port 6881, which is associated with BitTorrent and other P2P activity, as well as 27015, I think that's associated with some gaming activity, and then some icmp ports here. Then followed by 3389 TCP, which is a remote desktop protocol. We hadn't looked at that one for a little while, so I decided to take a little closer look at it. We're looking at the last 180 days of activity here, and this is looking at the number of sources that are doing the probing on this port. And as you can see, back in July timeframe, we saw an increase, clearly botnet activity, where we went from roughly 1,000 up to a little over 2,000 sources doing the scanning activity on this port. That eventually dropped off, and then we've seen sort of an upward trend since then. So it appears that there may be some recruiting activity that's going on, another little sort of bump in activity, and then another jump up. It's actually similar in size to what we saw back in July. This was actually around mid-November that we saw this, and it's stayed pretty stable since then, if not a little bit of a subtle increase. So the general trend here for port 3389 is that we're seeing more and more sources probing on this port over time, and it did bump up a couple of slots in our ranking. So something you may want to pay attention to. Remote desktop is you want to have, at the very least, very good authentication for access to any remote desktop services, whether you're using RDP or another service to facilitate that. I know a lot of folks that are telecommuting, you want to be able to make sure that they can get access to enterprise services from remotely, but you need to do a good job with that security, because there are a lot of activities that target that kind of capability.
There's a lot of push lately for people to move to these virtual hosted desktop type platforms, and a lot of those use RDP.
Yep.
So they need to be on the internet, but like you said, you need really good authentication. So I think there's probably a higher density over the past couple of years of RDP devices out there on the internet listing than there used to be.
Absolutely, I would expect that. And just to give you a look at the sources that are doing that probing activity, there's a pretty good density of that in the United States, even relative to Europe and Asia, which is suggesting that the conversation we just had, the density of those devices, and actually vulnerable devices that may be not only potentially exploited, but subsequently contributing to the probing activity. So that's our show for today. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, we certainly would like to hear from you. You can email us at threattrack@list.att.com, and you can find ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq. It's on YouTube as well as on iTunes if you prefer that path. You can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. I'd like to thank you, Jim. Thanks for joining today. Matt, John. I'm Brian Rexroad, and we'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.